Just thinking about self-preservation, Stuart. I'm relinquishing control.
You know, I did
I think everyone's coming in now. Welcome to the Brisbane Baylands EIR workshop, the fourth and last of our series. Tonight, it's going to be on the topic of hazard and hazardous materials, geology, biology, hydrology, water quality, and other CEQA topics. So anyway, it's been a long time coming, and this has been quite an interesting series. But I just want to go through a few things that I've said before. The purpose of the city's EIR consultant to provide an overview of the EIR. And it's not a formal planning commission meeting. We're just presenting this. After tonight, there will be the city hold on a second. After tonight, we hope that you all will read through the documents, and there will be a deadline to submit comments on October 8th, 2013. Written comments are strongly encouraged and can be submitted to the city at any time up to the deadline. Public meetings will also be held in September to accept public testimony, and we look forward to hearing from everyone at that time. The meeting dates and times are to be determined, and the city will provide those details once they are known. Tonight, again, the meeting will be 90 minutes. You'll be about an hour, and after that, we will have some time for questions. And thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to reintroduce Lloyd Zola of ESA.
We're back one more time. So we'll just do, again, a real quick basic introduction, and this is on the website, the presentation, and there's copies out there. Remember, the basic structure of each of the subjects is an environmental setting and a regulatory setting, And in the case of some of the issues tonight, the regulatory setting takes a greater emphasis. Significance criteria, what are the rules that we use in this document to determine whether an impact is significant or less than significant? And then the evaluation of impacts, mitigation measures, and a conclusion. The basic project is complex. There are land use scenarios called concept plan scenarios, and that is the land use plan. 4 different scenarios analyzed at an equal level of detail, and in some cases their impacts are the same. In other cases they will be different. A general plan amendment to achieve consistency of each of those scenarios with the general plan. A specific plan, that is the application that was filed by UPC, who's the largest landowner of the area, for their lands. Site-specific development, the movement of the lumber yards and the ecology expansion, which is in one of those 4 scenarios. A proposed water supply agreement, that is a transfer of water from the Oakdale Irrigation District ultimately to the city of Brisbane for use at the Baylands as well as other lands within the city, and an on-site water recycling facility. Same 4 scenarios. The first 2 are the developer-sponsored plan. Those are the ones that are included in the specific plan that was done by UPC, the Brisbane Baylands specific plan, that covers the entirety of the area except for the ecology site, includes 4,400 dwelling units as well as commercial uses for a total of 12.1 million square feet of residential and non-residential use. There is a variant to that proposes a sports arena, same number of units, about the same amount of total building area. And the community prepared plan, the land use plan being the outcome of this series of workshops that the community held a couple years ago that covers the entirety of our study area, including the ecology site, proposes no residential use and about 7.7 million square feet of commercial office space and nearly double the amount of open space as in the developer-sponsored plan. The last scenario is a variant of the community prepared plan, which includes the expansion of the ecology site from about 250,000 square feet to 1 million. Same amount of open space, again, no residential use. So through each of the sections, when we talk about land use or the land use plan, it's all 4 of those scenarios. My fingers are not working real well handling these. Okay. Hazardous materials. This is section 4G and one of the, I know for the community, most important parts of the EIR. The basic issues that are addressed come from Appendix G and the thresholds of state CEQA guidelines in Appendix G. And what we look at in this section is the routine, the normal course of events, use, transport, and disposal of hazardous materials that will occur during construction, the actual act of remediation, what are hazards that may be created by remediation, and the ongoing operation of the site following development. The second issue has to deal with creating hazards through reasonably foreseeable upset is what the state term is, but accident. What kinds of accidents are reasonably foreseeable that may result in the release of hazardous materials? And we look at it both during construction and during operation. Are there emissions of hazardous materials or hazardous emissions occurring within a quarter mile of a school? Generally air quality emissions, or are there hazardous materials uses within a quarter mile of a school? Hazards related to the location of hazardous materials sites. So there are sites in and around the Baylands that are licensed for the handling, transport, and in some cases disposal, creation of hazardous waste. one being Kinder Morgan, which is right at the center of the site. Although it's not part of the project site, the project site surrounds it. The other issue is airport-related safety hazards. Are there safety hazards related to operations at San Francisco Airport? Emergency response and evacuation. How does this development, or would it affect the ability of emergency operations to continue in case of an emergency? And the last one being wildland fires, which is easy to say. We don't have wildland around here, but interface into the wildlands, Icehouse Hill, San Bruno Mountain. The basic significance criteria are the creation of hazards related to the routine transport, use, or disposal. One of the key pieces of CEQA, and there's been a couple of court cases on this, is what CEQA focuses on is the impact of the project on the environment, not the other way around. So we're looking at what changes in the environment occur as the result of project development. The creation of hazards through accident conditions, so basically following the issues we're talking about. Is there hazardous materials, hazardous emissions, or handling of acutely hazardous materials occurring within a quarter-mile of an existing or future school? Is the site located as a hazardous material site and thereby creating a hazard? Safety hazards for lands within an airport land use plan, based on that airport land use plan in this case. So there is, San Francisco Airport has an airport land use plan, and the project is looked at in relation to that airport land use plan. Is the project located within the vicinity of a private airstrip? That does not occur here. Will project development impair implementation of emergency response or evacuation plan? Does this somehow make the job of the police department or fire department to respond in an emergency more difficult? And finally, exposing people or structures to wildland fire hazard. So that is the series of issues that are looked at, as well as the criteria for significance. Basic methods of mitigation, and there's a lot of different kinds of mitigation measures here. The first is confirming achievement of remediation goals. Now, I said in the case of hazardous materials section, the regulatory setting takes a different role than it does elsewhere in the document. In the case of hazardous materials, and I know this will be part of the public discussion, but under state law, responsibility for remediation in different portions of the site is given to or is assigned to Department of Toxic Substances Control, DTSC, and to the Regional Water Quality Control Board, San Francisco region. So one of the things that is part of the mitigation measures is how do we in fact confirm that mitigation has occurred, that it meets applicable standards before permitting site-specific development. And this is one of the cases where mitigation measures start dealing with this must occur, then remediation of the site, the plan approvals of the plan, and only then can site-specific development be approved. So that's what I mean by achievement, confirm the achievement. Soil and groundwater management plans for ongoing management of remediation efforts and ongoing efforts or ongoing management of soil and groundwater following remediation. Implementation of demolition and deconstruction plans. Buildings are old, they will have lead-based paint, they may have asbestos in them. How is that handled? Because demolition itself could create issues. NPDES permitting, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, which has to do with dealing with pollutant prevention and erosion prevention during grading, and in this case remediation operations. Hazardous materials business plans for future uses within the site. dealing with undergrounding of utilities and utility vaults anywhere within 500 feet of the landfill footprint. And that is focused on safety in relation to potential methane leakage. The grading of the two operable units that are part of the original, abandoned rail yard, that they are to be in accordance with Regional Water Quality Control Board and DTSC requirements regarding vapor barriers into the buildings. Again, that deals with the building construction itself, that all new structures constructed within the former landfill and in the portions of the western side of the site, anywhere within 1,000 feet of the waste material footprint has to incorporate subslab vapor control, gas monitoring ongoing after closure for trace gases. And the last part is that there is to be no, or are to be no, grade K through 12 schools within a half mile of a facility that has hazardous emissions or, as identified in state law, handles acutely hazardous materials without the permission of the California Department of Education. There's a state law that regulates location of schools in relation to these sites and a very formal procedure through the state to approve location of a school. Those are the mitigation measures proposed. Now, what you will see, I know in this community, most of you already know this, but on the east side of the site, there is a graphic that will show the footprint of the landfill, as well as the remediation unit that would require landfill closure, and that is in relation to both the Recology site and the rest of the site. It will show where the Kinder Morgan site is. And then on the west side of the site, the former rail yard, the responsibility areas of operable unit 1, operable unit 2, 1 being to the north, 2 being to the south, and areas of responsibility of those two agencies, the Regional Water Quality Control Board, that has responsibility for the former landfill, as well as operable unit 2 to the south, and the responsibility area of Department of Toxic Substances Control, which is operable unit 1, the northwest portion of the site. And so, as you look at the impacts and mitigation measures, they focus on what are the impacts of remediation, what are the impacts of ultimate use of the site in relation to these, in relation to the issues that we all know to be there, as opposed to what are those regulations? Because the regulatory setting that's described, the responsibilities of DTSC and the regional board, as they are now laid out, is the starting point for analysis. Next, we'll talk about geology, soils, and seismicity, which is section 4E. Two basic issues are discussed. One is seismic hazards, and it's more than just earthquake shaking, but ground settlement, expansive soils, and also soils and geologic hazard, expansive soils bearing strength of units. So the basic significance criteria, significant versus less than significant, are exposing people or structures to risk of loss of structures, injury or death involving, and these are the basic issues that are discussed: rupture along a known earthquake fault, strong seismic shaking, a building just being shaken into submission, seismic-related ground failure, compaction that would occur due to the shaking of a site in an earthquake, including liquefaction in areas of high groundwater, landslides. So even though the site is relatively flat, there are manufactured slopes, and on the landfill and some of the cuts into Icehouse Hill, looking at potential for landslides. Location on an unstable geologic unit, something that is shifting around. Location on expansive soils. There are soils that actually, when they get wet, will expand and contract, and the ground will move out, spread under a foundation, so that is looked at here. And the other criteria is soils incapable of supporting a septic tank or alternative wastewater system. Since this project is proposed to all connect to sewer, that is not there is no impact related to that. Basic methods of mitigation. The first one and obvious one is compliance with the building code. And as I mentioned, compliance with the law, meeting the building code, is part of the project. It is required as part of any project and not identified as a separate mitigation measure. In relation to the landfill area, one of the approvals of the regulatory agencies is what is called a post-earthquake inspection and corrective action plan that deals with the performance of the former landfill after closure during an earthquake or after an earthquake. And then no fill materials going within the lagoon, and slope safety requirements are part of our mitigation measures. Next section, 4C, biological resources. Fairly long section, and it comes down to two key issues. One is, what are the sensitive habitats and species and habitat areas and species within the baylands, that's within the 733 acres? And then habitat connectivity, continuous habitat and wildlife movement, as opposed to a patch here, a patch there, or cutting a habitat area in two. The basic significance criteria include direct or indirect, substantial adverse effect on a candidate, sensitive, or special status species. And some of them do exist or have the potential of existing here. Direct impacts, loss of habitat, taking habitat into development. Indirect impact, changing air patterns or changing drainage patterns and modifying habitat so that indirectly species are affected. Substantial adverse effect on riparian habitat or other sensitive communities. Obviously, the lagoon, the land surrounding the lagoon, and along the creeks and drainages, there are riparian habitat, and that's mapped in the document. Substantial adverse effect on federally protected wetlands, which would be a wetlands that qualifies for the definition of waters of the United States. Interfering with the movement of fish or wildlife species or wildlife corridors. So are we interfering with wildlife movement? And you'll see that discussion in relation primarily to avian species, birds, and potential effects of tall buildings, as well as wind turbines. Conflicting with any local policies regarding biological resources, such as the tree preservation ordinance, or conflicting with the provisions of an adopted habitat conservation plan. And in this case, the habitat conservation plan for San Bruno Mountain is adjacent to this site, but the site is not within that habitat plan. Basic methods of mitigation, and there are requirements in the EIR related to not only habitat preservation. You shall not disturb, modify, or destroy certain habitats on site, but requirements for, in some cases, restoration of habitat, as well as enhancement of existing habitat. So it's not just leave it. In some cases, the mitigation measures go farther. Then there are mitigation measures also in relation to building design treatments, particularly the taller buildings, and wind turbines to avoid bird strikes. And there's a discussion of bird strikes and the movement of birds and avian species through the site and how that could be affected by the project. So you will see in the EIR a graphic, and that's the graphic that identifies the habitats that exist within the site. And the primary issues, the ones that we saw in looking at the site, is the existing habitat within the site because of former use of the landfill, existing uses within the site, the former rail yard. The habitat within the site is really pretty highly disturbed and degraded. It's one of the starting points. but that there are areas of remaining significant and sensitive habitat types, Icehouse Hill, areas surrounding the lagoon, that essentially need preservation, enhancement. Icehouse Hill, the lagoon and its perimeter, there are emergent wetlands, areas that have some drainage through that wetlands are coming into being, emergent wetlands, that also warrant preservation and enhancement. And then I've mentioned, and then the trails on Icehouse Hill. One of the things that are in each of the 4 scenarios is having trails, so recreational trails, so people can hike up Icehouse Hill and back down. And there are potential habitat for sensitive butterfly species on Icehouse Hill. So one of the things you'll see in the mitigation measures are requirements and some limitations on the ability to put a trail anywhere on Icehouse Hill as a means of protecting the plants that would be host for the sensitive butterflies. So it's a balancing. How do we get both recreation, the trails on the hill, as well as protect the sensitive species? And then, as I've mentioned, the bird strikes in relation to new buildings and wind farms, and then also site lighting, outdoor lighting of parking areas, streets, and addressing those can have an effect, because right now at night that site is dark. And besides the aesthetic issues of dark night sky and lighting up people's houses or adjacent uses, this section looks at night lighting in relation to habitat areas. The next section is 4H, dealing with surface water hydrology and water quality. And the reason that this section deals with surface water hydrology is that in the hazardous materials section, one of the major areas of contamination is groundwater. Groundwater in relation to leachate from the landfill, as well as Schlag Loch and groundwater contamination there. So we deal with groundwater issues in the case of the Baylands as a hazardous materials issue, as opposed to a water supply or groundwater basin issue as we might otherwise. Just we had it at one time in writing this in the hydrology section, then realized the hazardous materials section was missing a big piece, and rather than having the same thing in 2 places. So you will see groundwater hydrology, geohydrology in the hazardous materials section. So what we're addressing here is flooding. And flooding not only in terms of increase in the amount of runoff because of new development. So basically, as you take open ground, dirt, and put buildings on it, streets on it, parking lots, the amount of runoff increases. But we look at in this section, what are the effects of sea level rise and the rising of the bay? And then also quality of water running along the surface, so surface water quality. The basic significance criteria are, first, would, as a result of the project, there be a violation of any water quality standards or waste discharge? Remember when we talked about public services and facilities or utilities, the wastewater system and recycled water plant will not discharge into the lagoon, into the bay, and so it will get discharge effectively into, or not effectively, sewage will discharge as it does now to SFPUC. Would the project substantially deplete groundwater supplies or interfere with groundwater recharge? And that is put in Appendix G, largely in relation to use of groundwater for drinking water supply. What would be the effect of a project on availability of groundwater? Altering the area's drainage pattern, resulting in erosion, so just moving drainage is itself not a significant impact, but if by altering drainage the project would create pollution, it would create erosion, siltation, or additional flooding, the changing of direction of runoff would be a significant impact. And one of the things you'll see in the project description is creek now goes underground. Part of what will happen with this project will be to daylight essentially bring to the surface and open up existing underground drainage in a more natural setting. Would the project overreach the capacity of existing stormwater drainage systems? Doesn't take much to go out there and figure out the existing storm drainage system isn't capable of handling development that's there now, let alone new development. So this is an example where you will see identification of a significant impact, a mitigation measure that calls for new drainage systems to handle drainage, and then a conclusion of mitigation. So that's kind of the definition we talked about at the beginning of a significant but mitigable impact. Would the project degrade water or add new sources of pollution and polluted runoff? Any new development, any urban development does that. Runoff from, take a look at people's cars and what drips out from under the car. Brake fluid, and just normal urban runoff is a source of pollution. There are mitigation measures for that. Or if you think about landscaping, we treat landscaping with pesticides, we put fertilizer on it. And so that is one of the impacts addressed here. Would the project put people in a 100-year floodplain, impede flow of the 100-year flood? 100-year flood is one of the terms you will see, and it's basically a statistical issue. What is the size of flood that in any year, any 1 year, has a 1% chance of happening? Or if you hit the perfect statistical thing, it would happen about once every 100 years. So it's a size flood, and there are ways of measuring that 100-year flood, but that is the basic standard that is used, protection from a 100-year flood. Exposing people to risk of loss, injury, or death because of flooding. And then inundation by a seiche, which is, let's picture in an earthquake, we've got a water tank, the water starts shaking. Would that rupture a water tank? A tsunami, seismic sea wave, entering the bay and affecting the bay, or mud flow, a little bit different than a landslide, but mud flow would be in a heavy rain, a slope giving way and just mud washing down as opposed to a failure of a slope. Those are the significance criteria we deal with here. And the basic methods of mitigation are stormwater management plans, SWEEPY, I love that name, Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, which is a requirement under state law on how stormwater will be managed to avoid contamination. The NPDES that I mentioned, permitting that I mentioned earlier, drainage system improvements, and then in here is also a mitigation measure dealing with integrated pest management. In other words, how do we manage pest control instead of choosing insecticides as the primary means and essentially looking at eradicating pests through poison? How do we manage pests in a non-lethal way to eliminate as much as we can use of pesticides, herbicides, and so on? And then finally, an assessment of sea level rise and adaptation to sea level rise. So one of the things you'll see in this section, ready for the next one? I knew I'd catch you sooner or later, is the identification of the existing 100-year flood zones. And these are mapped by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. And the green that you'll see in there, really we should have used blue, I guess, are the flood zones as they exist today, the 100-year flood zones. When we analyze sea level rise using a kind of a mid-range, what you see in the pink being added are areas that would be flooded in the event of sea level rise combined with tidal flow as well as a 100-year flood. So there are areas that would be subject to flooding in the future as a result of sea level rise that are not today. The last set of issues I'll talk about were the one that were referred to as the other CEQA issues. And basically what these are is significant unavoidable impacts, growth inducement, and cumulative impacts. So, significant unavoidable effects we've identified in these sections of the environmental impact report. And what a significant unavoidable effect is, it's when we identify as a result of the project, one of those thresholds would be exceeded, there is a significant impact. Because there is a significant impact, we are obligated to identify all feasible mitigation and implement all feasible mitigation, and then look at, will that mitigation reduce impacts to a less than significant level? And in some cases, in the case of each of these sections, mitigation measures will not reduce impacts to a less than significant level. So in aesthetics and visual resources, air quality, biological resources, greenhouse gas impacts, as we talked a couple times ago in relation to two of the scenarios, noise impacts during construction, in particular related to potential for pile driving, population and housing, the amount of people and amount of jobs being proposed, traffic and circulation, as well as utilities, service systems, and water supply. Now, there can be a couple different reasons that mitigation measures would not be effective in reducing impacts to a less than significant level. One would be the impact is just too significant and there's no physical way of doing it. In terms of traffic, that is the case, as we talked about, in relation to future, even without project. The city's existing standard of level of service D will be exceeded, and there's no mitigation measure available, or no, I should say no feasible mitigation measure available that would fix that. That's one type of mitigation. There are others that you will see that a mitigation measure, again in traffic, remember there are impacts that are going to occur in San Francisco as a result of project development. There will be impacts that occur in Daly City as a result of development. And while we can in this EIR identify this is what ought to be done to the intersection of Bayshore at any intersection in San Francisco or any intersection in Daly City, those can be identified. We can even require the developer to, or require future development to participate in mitigation of those impacts. The one thing we cannot do as a community is force San Francisco to accept redoing an intersection. We cannot force Daly City to add turn lanes that they don't want to. So what you will see in the traffic section, and more here I think than anywhere else, and I can't remember anywhere else this actually occurs, is you will see an impact, you will see mitigation measures, a mitigation measure, and then you will see as part of the conclusion how effective is that mitigation measure, a discussion that while the physical, some are physically feasible, you could add that turn lane, because we cannot compel another city to accept the improvement, we cannot legally claim that it's mitigated and therefore an impact is significant and unavoidable. There are some where just given the Muni line and physically you can't widen, but there are some that the conclusion is we cannot compel San Francisco to, we cannot compel Daly City to, therefore significant. Now, a significant impact, as I said in the very first section, does not prevent the city from approving the project. The flip side of that is even if everything was mitigated and there were no significant impacts, you are not obligated to approve either. But what you will see as this process moves on is in order to adopt any project, approve any project that has a significant unavoidable impact, the city must weigh the severity of the impacts against benefits of the project and then make a determination, do the benefits of the project outweigh the impacts? And that is called a statement of overriding considerations. And in relation to each of these impacts, You as the Planning Commission, at the end of this process, when final EIR is in front of you, will be asked to make that determination. What are the benefits of the project? And there'll be draft findings, but what are the benefits of the project meeting those project objectives that we talked about at the beginning? What are the impacts, and weigh them against each other? And that will be one of the tasks that you'll be asked to make a recommendation on, and it would be part of the final determination by the council should any significant impact exist. The next two subjects that are in Chapter 6 deal with cumulative impacts. Remember at the beginning we talked about this whole EIR, or Chapter 4, deals with what are the impacts of the project, all those different components. What this section deals with is what happens when we take all of the impacts we just talked about in Chapter 4 and add them to development of the redevelopment projects in Daly City, add them to the development proposed in San Francisco and approved by San Francisco in the Hunters Point, Candlestick Point EIR, Hunters Point Shipyard, and other projects within the city, build out of Sierra Point, continuing build out of approved projects that are not yet built. When you take all of those projects together, cumulative development, what are the impacts of all of it together? So not only will you get an analysis in this EIR of the project development of the Baylands, there will be an analysis of what does it look like when you add that to surrounding development. And you'll see that actually in Chapter 4 in traffic, where we take cumulative development, all those other projects, background traffic, add it to the project. In Chapter 6, we do that for the rest of the subjects as required by state law. So 2 questions are asked for each subject. So in relation to aesthetics, in relation to biology, in relation to cultural resources, and through all of those subjects in Chapter 4. The first one is when we take the impacts of the project and add them to past projects, things that are approved, not yet built, present projects, things that are now in the hopper, plus reasonably foreseeable future projects. So if we know about a project that may come up, take that all together and we ask 2 questions. The first one is, are those cumulative impacts significant? And you take them all together. So even if the impacts of the Baylands on any of the subjects we analyze are less than significant, when we add them up with all those other projects, do we now have a cumulatively significant impact, even though any one project may be less than significant? And the second issue is, what is the contribution of this project to that cumulative significant impact? So are we in this community in approving a project, the Baylands, contributing in a substantial manner to the large-scale cumulative impact? What you will see in Chapter 6 is basically the EIR identifies what are those cumulative projects. Talked about some, Hunters Point, the redevelopment in Daly City, electrification of Caltrain. And there's a list of all these projects, a short description of them, and a map of them. So we're using a list of projects. Each section will define what is the geographic area we're looking at, because for cultural resources, you add all these projects up and impacts behave differently than they would in terms of traffic, which gets wider spread than cultural, which is based around cultural sites, or biology, which is habitat based. So there'll be a description of the area, and then the analysis we just talked about, or I just talked about. Are the effects significant cumulatively, and what is the project's contribution? The last thing that you'll see in the document is, would the project site induce growth? Obviously in relation to project development, induce growth. Obviously in relation to the Baylands, it induces growth because it is proposed to create, in the developer-sponsored plan, dwelling units, It is intended to create employment areas. That's pretty obvious. But beyond that, would development of the Baylands create or induce growth beyond what's just proposed on the Baylands? And that could occur as a result of a couple things. One would be removing an obstacle in relation to infrastructure improvements. So if you can picture an area, there is no wastewater treatment capacity. Somebody proposes a project, you build a wastewater treatment plant that can serve an area much larger, and now all sorts of vacant land outside the project site has access to wastewater, which was preventing development. That's growth inducement. We look at the water supply agreement in relation. So we look at the infrastructure proposed for this project. Does it or could it create growth beyond what we've just analyzed on the Baylands? The water supply agreement, 2,000 acre feet for the Baylands, plus 400 acre feet for other uses in the city. Obvious issue is, if we've got 400 acre feet for other uses, build out of Sierra Point and other areas, by adding that water supply, we're removing a constraint, which is lack of water supply, so that 400 acre feet to build out Sierra Point and build out the city's general plan is that definition of growth inducement. But what we need to be careful about, or as you read it, growth inducement is the simple fact of removing a constraint. Again, as throughout the EIR, the good or bad of that growth inducement is not part of what's being analyzed. So the EIR will identify as a constraint being removed, not, gee, that's a bad thing it's being removed, or a good thing it's being removed. And then looking at the amount of jobs and housing. So if we create, as part of a city approval, jobs on the site, those workers will be looking for housing, and that's another way of growth inducement, and that's analyzed. Again, not good or bad, but that's just part of the information to identify. So that is, after 4 sessions, the Baylands EIR. And as I start wrapping up, then take questions. I again just want to remind you and the commission and the public, this EIR is not the end of environmental review for the ultimate development of the Baylands. There will be additional environmental review prior to buildings actually being built. So I know there's been discussion about how do we review this EIR because, or even the project, because we don't know where exactly the buildings are going to be. We don't know exactly what they're going to look like, how they're going to be placed, and so there's a lot of variables involved. And so what CEQA provides for is what's called a ProgramEIR. So in the very same way a number of years back when the city adopted its general plan and you set the rules for future development for your community, you did not know and could not know where will buildings be built citywide. When you analyze the aesthetic impacts of the general plan, you could not know how that would exactly affect views. But that EIR under CEQA had a very important value. And it's easy to think, until we know all the details, how do we evaluate anything? But the reason that we do, and the reason CEQA provides for ProgramEIRs is this. Because one, if we only did environmental documents, at the time there is a site-specific project, which in some states is how they do environmental review. They are attached to building projects. You never really get to what is the large-scale overall impact of the rules we're about to set. All the actions we might take over the next 20 years, when you put it all together, what are the implications of that basic rule setting that we're being asked to do? The other thing that you will see in the mitigation measures, and even in the assessment of what are the total impacts, is the EIR and its mitigation measures will establish essentially performance standards for future development. And so site-specific projects the building of buildings, site plans within the Baylands will be assessed first for their impacts against the overall impacts that are identified in the EIR. And so what is being done in the approvals that are, or in the project that is in front of you now, is a request to approve a land use plan, policies for the future development of the Baylands, essentially at a general plan level. Same way you have a general plan that says, here are some basic rules for the development of the Baylands, for the development of the Beatty sub-area. That is what this EIR aims at, are those rules that would be applied to future development on the Baylands. It also establishes maximum amounts of impact, that when you as a planning commission make a recommendation to council of this is what we believe ought to be approved at the end, whatever that happens to be, and council approves some land use plan, the environmental analysis of that sets a maximum, essentially sets a cap on the impacts that development of the entire Baylands would be permitted to have. As projects then come in relationship to those rules, we now have a building site within the Baylands and a proposal to build a school campus, to build a campus of office buildings, or in the case of the developer-sponsored plan, to build any residential project. You would then go back through an environmental process, because that itself is another discretionary action, and evaluate what are the impacts of building this portion of the Baylands. Is this consistent with what we agreed on as maximum impacts? Does this site-specific project implement the mitigation measures that were laid out in the original EIR? And do we need additional mitigation measures because of some of the peculiarities and things happening site-specific? Now, why would we want to do in two parts? And one example would be looking at views out over the site of San Francisco Bay by setting the rules and adopting the mitigation measure that says within, and it works out to 350 feet of the freeway, buildings will be no taller than 80 feet, no matter what is now in the specific plan, setting a maximum height. From the viewpoints in that aesthetic section, people will be able to look over the buildings and see the bay. What that means is, now when a developer comes in and somebody's going to build buildings adjacent to the freeway, they will know, don't design anything within that band over 80 feet in height. Not going to be permitted. If you try to do everything all at the same time, you get the design, and then we find out, oh, that's too tall. So the idea is, this was the opportunity, and is the opportunity for the community to set the rules of the game. No matter what got proposed to you, this is the opportunity to do that. And so we have the EIR and the original, or the set of applications in front of the city. And what that will do is, right now, is that upfront process to review project-wide impacts and set the basis for reviewing project by project by project as you go. And so that is the purpose of this EIR, how it relate to next steps, which will be long after, maybe not long after, but after this process of review and approval, and you get to actual development of the Baylands, there will be another set of reviews. So the next steps in terms of what we're doing here, close of the public review period will be October 8th. That's when written comments are needed by. But in September, there will be 2 nights where designed for public input on the evaluations in the EIR. So that's where we'll take public input if you want to give input verbally in those meetings as opposed to in writing, or do both. Those meetings will be for the purpose of taking comment on the EIR. The review period will close October 8th, And then from there, the way the CEQA process ends is we will take all of the verbal comments received in the 2 September meetings, all of the written comments received through October 8th. A set of written responses will be prepared for each of those comments. That will be matched with or supplemented with any revisions to the draft EIR that are needed because of those comments and responses. That package is called a final EIR, although in reality it only becomes final after it's handed to the Planning Commission. You will be asked to recommend what is called certification of that EIR, essentially to certify that the EIR meets the requirements of CEQA. Then the EIR will go in front of the City Council, who will then also be asked, not to make a recommendation, but to certify the EIR as meeting to certify the final EIR as meeting the requirements of CEQA. That final EIR being the draft EIR you have now, all of the comments received, all of the responses, along with any revisions that are needed. That is, in short, the environmental process. And with that, I'd be glad to take any questions. Yes? Wait, we got the microphone coming. We're up here. Okay.
You can. I'd like to ask about noise, and noise in 2 parts. One is I noticed, over and over it's been said, you said it, and the other gentleman who spoke to us in a previous meeting introducing the draft EIR talked about how the EIR's purpose is to assess its impacts on what is outside of the project, not the environment's impact on the project. Is that right? That's been said several times, and it is a trick question.
Yeah. It
has to do with noise.
It has to do with noise. There's 2 things. The difference is it is the impact of the project on the environment, not the impact of the environment on the project. So, I'll fill in the second part.
Okay.
Because when we identify the impact of the project on the environment, let's picture in the case of if residential is and ends up being approved, there would be, we'll assume pile driving plus residential. Pile driving going on, creation of noise as a result of construction later phases, and residential. The project itself, as development occurs, becomes part of the environment. So as we look at noise impacts, that also has to do with, with land use compatibility in relation to noise and impacts of project construction on later phases. So when we say not the impact of the environment on the project, analysis of impacts can occur within the project site. Another example, pile driving in relation to impact vibration in relation to historic buildings. That's clearly on the site. So when I said not the impact of the environment on the project, if an area, it gets this, there will be a nuance here. An earthquake, we do not look at the impact of an earthquake. So, but the reason we look at in geology section loss of life is the impact of the project is to place people and buildings in a location subject to geologic hazards. So always look at that, what does the project change in the environment as opposed to the impacts of the environment. Impacts of, and I know John hammered me on this one, when you look at the Kinder Morgan site, what are the impacts of that on the project? But that is part, and land use compatibility and those issues, that becomes part of the planning review, consistency with the general plan in relation to people on site seeing Kinder Morgan, the requirements for screening of that site, come out of not the impact that that facility would have on the environment, except in one case. People will be placed as a result of the project in relation to storage of fuel. So that's kind of that difference of impact on the environment, impact of environment on the project.
And the other part was about, you have cumulative, in your appendices, you have cumulative noise tables, but the cumulative noise appears to be from traffic. So where in the cumulative noise calculation is the airport's noise? Because you have noise in excess of 57 dBA over large areas, and there's a study in Northern Europe or England that shows that 57 is the number over which there's a stress reaction on the part of human beings. So I just was curious if these high numbers do not include airport noise, even though the way it's all weighted, it probably wouldn't make a great deal of difference, but it could push you over 65 over the entire
Yeah.
project, it looks like.
Provide that comment, that starts getting into the differences of the logarithmic scale, but that's the kind of comment we really need on the document, would help with some of that clarification. Yes?
In your experience with projects of this magnitude, have you ever seen a three-dimensional model provided by the developer to help people assess the impacts?
That's a loaded question. Talking about trick questions, that was a good one. The easy answer is to say that, yes, I have seen them. They are sometimes done, they sometimes are helpful, sometimes are not, accuracy aside. But the request for a three-dimensional model is really outside the SQL world. So that's part of that planning review to help people, and you would request it that way. You can provide that comment as part of the EIR comments. One of the responses will be the city will consider that response, but it's not a substantive environmental issue. Or over here. Okay.
One of the things you said was a mitigation measure was that there would be no fill materials in the lagoon. The northern boundary of the lagoon is fill material. So to say there'd be no fill materials in the lagoon, it's a little late for that.
More accurately, no additional fill.
Unfortunately, I don't think we really know what is in the lagoon. And my understanding is that there was no additional testing done, say, samples made of the bottom of the lagoon, what's in the sediment underneath it. I think that could be a substantial risk to human health and to the environment, especially with some of the uses that are being proposed for the lagoon. And I just wondered why that wasn't investigated at all.
Again, looking at changes in changes caused by the project, make sure we get that comment, and we'll go through the whole explanation. And then as part of the determination of the community, of commission, then council, and in looking at responses, then there'll be a determination what additional work, if necessary, should be going on.
Well, I'm going to skip then to the question I had about does the draft DEIR address all the comments and questions that were raised during the notice of preparation, because that very comment was raised during the notice of preparation. So if it's not addressed in the current draft DEIR, were the other comments that were raised during the notice of preparation period addressed or ignored, or what?
Yeah. Addressed or ignored, that, yeah. The way that, the relationship of the notice of preparation and comments on the notice of preparation as part of the drafting of the draft EIR, the writing of the draft EIR, there were determinations made as to where the potentials for significant impacts laid. And if in your review of the draft EIR, you believe, and the comment that you're making is that the determination should have been made regarding there was a potential for a significant impact that should have been analyzed. So if you see any of those areas in comments or in the comments on the NOP that were not addressed or not addressed as completely as you believe should be, those are the kinds of comments that need to be made during this period, and then there will be under CEQA, a required response to that either explains why ultimately the city and city council believe that it need not be done, or that, yes, you are correct, it should be done, and that analysis would then be made part of the final EIR.
Okay. So the question I was going to ask is, what about downwind habitats, like the Candlestick Cove and the bay right there? You talked about, I mean, have we addressed that, like the shorebirds and Candlestick Cove and shading of the bay and wind patterns of the cove and changes in surface habitat of the water, as well as garbage blowing into the bay from the project? Has that been addressed also?
If I remember correctly, not the last one, garbage blowing into the bay, but again, those are the kinds of comments that should be submitted. Then we'll go back through that review. Was the correct determination made initially in scoping of the document, and a response as to what is the appropriate way to go? Additional study or not additional study because the impact is still believed to be less than significant? Yes, sir.
I have a question about growth inducement. I believe you said that it wasn't a judgment, it was just a statement of whether the project would cause growth inducement. So my question is, since it's a neutral comment, what is the community to do with information about growth inducement? Can the community say, we want to cut back on growth inducement because we don't want any, or we want to accept it because we do want? What is the community supposed to say about that?
And that's part of the use of the EIR as a tool in the decision-making process on the project itself. One example would be, and the easy one to look at, because you'll see this discussion, is in relation to the water supply agreement. That the amount of water supply in that agreement, maximum amount, is the amount needed for the most intensive water use scenario. So if you would end up approving or wanting to approve a far less intense alternative, so if the decision was the community wants to approve the renewable energy alternative, the community wants to approve the lower intensity non-residential alternative, retaining the maximum amount of the water supply in the water supply agreement, all 2,000 acre feet for the baylands, they don't need 2,000 acre feet. That's growth inducement. So you would have two choices. One is, let's still take all 2,000 acre feet because there are things we want to use that for over and above the 400 we had assumed just for the rest of the city, or we will cut back the 2,000 acre feet just for what it would be needed under that alternative or that scenario. That description is even in the alternative section. When you read the alternative section, the description of those lower intensity alternatives will talk about the growth-inducing impact of accepting all 2,000 acre feet in a less intense alternative. But that's the notion of a decision-making tool as part of the planning review. Yes, sir.
Yes, to seismicity, you have a really good map in here that shows how the area was filled over a century, but basically the entire site is fill. It's also on the ABAG map as a liquefaction area, and I think you've got a map that shows a fault line going under the north part of it. And, of course, we all know about Christchurch, New Zealand, and the cars that sunk in the ground, and they decided maybe we shouldn't have built there. So, to me, it seems like we've got kind of a similar decision facing us. And I don't see it shown as a significant unavoidable effect. I see something about the building code, and it's hard for me to see how the building code can overcome all of that.
Okay. That's that issue of the state standard. And as I mentioned, compliance with the building code and the seismic standards in the building code are presumed to be mitigation, but something to think about, and this is all part of the decision, the comments that you're, we're requesting from you, is the mitigation measure is not necessary, and the building code is not written that after the major earthquake, in earthquake language, maximum credible earthquake, what's the biggest one that we can reasonably expect to have happen, that buildings remain habitable. So the standard is written that the building doesn't collapse and kill people, as opposed to you can go on living in the same building. Big sinkhole opening up, cars going in, houses being sucked in, that is obviously not what the building code is intending. And part of the issue you're raising is the building code adequate? And that would be one of the comments that you'd be invited to make. If that's the concern, as I'm thinking I understand, is the building code enough? That is one of the things that we should be asked to respond to as part of the final EIR. Yes, sir.
I understand that approximately half of the soil from the eastern part is going to be moved over to the western part. Is that, are the effects of that discussed in the soil and geology section?
Yes, the effect of moving soil from east to west, west to east, and just going back a step, we talk about fill in the lagoon. Basically, everything, gotta get my direction right, east of Bayshore, the entire site is fill. Over a period of years, you'll see that graphic in there, the successive filling of the bay, or you look at historic maps of San Francisco, a lot of that is fill. So the movement of soil, the safety of moving soil is part of the analysis in the hazard section, yes. He's on the way.
We talked several times about good or bad, and if one can assume that the will of the people in 1994, which had a general plan passed by 2/3, is, if we call that good, rather than as kind of when you said it, it sounds like it's a moral value. Well, it isn't a moral value, it's a community value. Mm-hmm. And in that way, it isn't really inappropriate to say something is good if good is defined as being part of what the general plan calls for. And I guess that was bugging me, and I thought I wanted to ask that. This is a very extensive document, and you pointed out, I think in another meeting, that there's, say, 6,000 more pages in the appendices, and there's 1,500 here. So you're asking the general, you are not, but the community is, or the city is, asking the general public to evaluate about 8,000 pages of technical data and come up with a conclusion as to what they can accept or not accept. And it seems to me that that given, at least in my opinion, it's like there's some difficult when it comes to saying what is significant and what isn't significant, to say what would mitigate that significance into insignificance. I think that it's what's bothered me is that there's this, like in the case of Ice House Hill, and you talked about whether or not a trail would affect the butterflies, that the endangered species that may be there. And it's kind of like, well, I would think that trail has a lot less to do with it than this whole circle of significant unavoidable effects. And I use that example because in a way it reminds me of the entire document, where what appear to me to be much more significant items that have not been fully mitigated are said to be mitigated, and you carefully tell what criteria, what standards you use. I would appreciate it if somebody would use a reasonable person standard, because under a reasonable person standard, to say that 12 and 12.1 million have less impact on greenhouse gas, even though you've gone through this and you explain how that something half that or 2/3 that size could have more, I couldn't actually buy that. And I think that it would be helpful if the city would hire an independent peer review to help the public, the commission, and themselves to look this over, because I think it's difficult for you to review your own material and say, well, we did this wrong, or because it's your opinion, your expert opinion. But I would sure hope that something else can be done, because this is such a huge project. And you've done a great deal of work, and I can see how you've been successful at it, from what I can understand, in a lot of areas. But in other areas, and they're very important ones, it seems to me that this underplays the significant and overplays a lot of trivia. It's not trivia to some people, but it's like, to me it is. And I guess I would ask you to comment on the idea of if you have seen in the past people hire a peer review environmental scientist to help the public with these issues.
That's certainly a comment to write. It's not typical. But as you look at all of those different thresholds and the concept of reasonable person, those are the comments as you go through the document, even one by one. Identify the thresholds that you're uncomfortable with, the analyses and conclusions you're uncomfortable with, and identify, and then the city needs to respond to this. The legal standard at the end, and one of the findings that the commission will be asked to make in making a recommendation to the council, and ultimately the council will be asked to make, is no matter what a series of environmental experts wrote in that document, when all is said and done, the standard is, does this document represent the independent judgment of the city? And so ultimately, this is information being put in front of the commission to make a recommendation to council, and then council will not and cannot certify the EIR unless they determine, based on the document, the comments you provide, the response to comments, that they are comfortable that this represents their judgment. So that what can happen, and does happen sometimes, is the final EIR goes into its public hearings, and you make a determination, does that meet the independent judgment of the city? And if it does, the document can be certified, and if it doesn't, you ask for additional analysis. But ultimately, it's the independent judgment of the city that is the guiding factor. So please provide those comments, and specific to each one that you do find yourself uncomfortable with, so that we can work through each one under CEQA, and we'll try and also make clear some of those issues of what is appropriate to, and the issues appropriate to the CEQA threshold, as opposed to some that start getting into the planning review and slightly different judgments, because that reasonable person standard has much more, not bearing, but is really at the center of the planning review, whereas the thresholds above or below. And one thing that we do not have in CEQA, and you will not see here, is ranking the importance of one threshold against another, nor do you see an analysis that says, and this used to be popular, the impact is slightly above, is marginally significant, is really significant, or whatever terms and adjectives and adverbs that you put to it. It's a very, in some ways, simple judgment. It is or is not above a threshold. The planning judgment as to how important that is, or how much, and how do you weigh the importance of a significant impact, the adversity of a significant impact, or even the adversity of a less than significant impact, that is really at the center of the project judgment that occurs as part of the planning review. And so, as part of the comments, we can help sort out some of those issues. Then ultimately, council will be asked to make that final determination. We have a comment over here. Question? Oh, we're up here, and then we'll go back there. I'm following the hands and not the microphone. I'm sorry.
I got it.
Okay.
I was reading about the traffic impacts, and at several points, the document says that the traffic analysis relies on events or programs that have yet to be fulfilled. And so is this one of the things that comes under unavoidable impacts? Significant unavoidable impacts is saying, you know, this analysis relies on building this multimodal terminal and extending the street and putting in this intersection, and the city, San Francisco does this, and San Mateo County does this. Is that one of the things you're talking about in significant unavoidable impacts? Or would the absence of any of those programs coming to fruition mean that another CEQA analysis would have to be done on the traffic impacts?
Okay. In relation to that series of projects, what the intent is in looking at cumulative traffic impacts, we look at what is the background traffic, what are the approvals of other projects that would be occurring same time and putting traffic out onto the streets. And so you have, and we talked about the major approvals at Candlestick Point, Hunters Point Shipyard, the redevelopment projects in Daly City. So the cumulative traffic analysis accounts for all of the traffic that will be created by those projects. So the 10,000 units in Hunters Point and the millions of square feet that would be built, the traffic from all of those is part of that cumulative without project future baseline. What then is done is to look at what facilities are those projects that we're including in the future baseline, what are they required to build? So those become part of the future baseline roadway and improvement system. Because otherwise, we're trying to analyze what happens if San Francisco builds 10,000 dwelling units, a few million square feet of building, but doesn't actually follow through and make the developers build any of the facilities that they were required to build. So you get a very skewed analysis. So as you look at those improvements, the thing to look for is, are the improvements that are assumed, do they relate to, are they actually required? So if we got some in there that aren't actually required by those development projects, that is what needs to be called out. If there are improvements that they're required to make that aren't there, then the impacts may be too great. So it's that match. The significant unavoidable impact would come this way. We require, as part of the Baylands project, improvement of an intersection in San Francisco. Part of the mitigation, because we know when you add in the developer sponsor plan 4,000 dwelling units, several million square feet, 12 million square feet of total building area, when you add that much traffic in any of the scenarios, impacts don't end at the city limits. Impacts on the roadway system extend into San Francisco, they extend into Daly City. And so the mitigation measures for each of the intersections that are analyzed, if the standards, level of service standards are exceeded, there is mitigation required. Add a right turn lane, add a through lane, add a left turn lane, change signal timing, signalize an unsignalized intersection. There's mitigation provided for every intersection. You can require, and you know for certain within Brisbane, that's going to get built. What we can't guarantee, what you can't guarantee as a community, is that San Francisco is going to say, okay, you can add a lane of traffic. We'll go ahead and change the signal timing of our intersection. That also occurs in terms of signalization. You don't see that here, but if you had mitigation measures that say, change the timing of signals at, well, if you go down Bayshore, there's interchange down there that's signalized. In order to make traffic flow better and make the left turn onto southbound 101, we want to change the signal timing so more people can make the left turn lane onto the southbound freeway. Caltrans could then come back, even though it's perfectly logical mitigation to make that interchange work better and make that signal work better, Caltrans could come back and say, nah, we would rather the traffic just stack up on the street than end up on the freeway at that rate. So we're going to use ramp metering or the signal to regulate the number of people coming on the freeway. You cannot, as a community, tell Caltrans, too bad, we want that mitigated. So that's the significant unavoidable, when you cannot essentially guarantee implementation of a mitigation measure. There was
Yes, I have
question.
on
Oh,
the
here
next
we are.
one, actually. By the way, your 7.7 million square feet do not match chart number 3.2C. It should be 8.1 and 8.2.
I'm sorry. Okay,
And-
8.1, 8.2.
Yeah, that needs to be corrected.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of along the same lines, you talked about, we talked the other day about landfill capacity, and tonight you mentioned about discharge to the SFPUC for the sewage or the waste that isn't recycled within the project or within the program or whatever. But I have a great concern because you said we can't force San Francisco or Daly City or the peninsula or whatever to do mitigation. So we give our effluent to SFPUC, and then they turn around and dump it in the bay or dump it wherever. Aren't we still ultimately responsible? And isn't that an impact that of the project or the program EIR that we're not properly addressing because we're just shoving shit downhill to somebody else?
Okay, a couple things involved in that. One is the first level of analysis comes about in terms of, you mentioned landfill capacity. Is there capacity in the plant to accept the sewage? And so that was compared to the amount of sewage that would be generated in each of the scenarios to the contractual commitment of City of San Francisco, SFPUC, to accept sewage from Bayshore Sanitary District and the city. So they are obligated under the agreement to accept the sewage up to their contractual amount. The second question that you raise is a what if. What if San Francisco and SFPUC violates their discharge standards? Should we not, as part of the Baylands, because we would be, if they do that, we're obviously contributing because it's our sewage going through that plant. And that's that notion or the basic parameter under CEQA that we assume, and a basic underlying premise is compliance with the law. So if there is a discharge requirement in place, as there is for the SFPUC treatment plant, individual projects do not analyze, so what if San Francisco violates the law? So the comment that should be made, and this becomes part of the planning review, is to raise that issue, but the CEQA answer is CEQA does not analyze the possibility that another agency would violate the law. The presumption is compliance with the law.
But what if their law says it's okay to dump the wastewater into the bay?
Yeah. So what to look at is what are the discharge requirements, and do you as a community agree with the discharge requirements? Because there is a requirement placed on San Francisco. They don't get to choose all on their own the quality of water that comes out of the plant. So they are, I was going to use the term regulated utility, but that usually means tariffs. Their discharge requirements are set by the Water Quality Control Board. And so those are the requirements for the operation of that plant. And that would be the same for any treatment plant. The operator doesn't get to choose their own discharge requirements. Imagine a world where they could. That would be the disaster you talk about. But there are requirements set by the state through the regional board to address that. Yes?
Well, the last two speakers started to approach the question I have, which is also about cumulative impacts. the Brisbane project related to Brisbane is a large project. Related to San Francisco, it's probably not as large a project. The San Francisco project is huge compared to it, and I don't know what the Daly City one looks like, but the impacts don't stop at the border. That's why it's called a cumulative impact based on the impact of the other jurisdictions. But this is really a project for the entire area. Is there a way of getting an EIR that covers the entire area as opposed to divide and conquer, which it seems to me this really is, even if it's not intentional?
Yeah. It keeps getting, yeah, so you look at the cumulative being bigger and bigger. I would argue, not argue, but that's not the right term. The EIR that has been out on the street, and I can't remember exactly where it is right now, but ABAG and the MTC released the EIR on Plan Bay Area. That evaluates at a much more general level projected development throughout the entire San Francisco Bay Area. So the MTC and ABAG have, and by law, put together a greenhouse gas reduction program required by law that is called a Sustainable Communities Strategy that addresses reduction of greenhouse gas emissions for the entirety of the Bay Area. So you can actually look at the EIR. You find it either on ABAG's website or MTC's website, wherever you start. Plan Bay Area will give you that cumulative analysis of development throughout the Bay Area. Now you can imagine the specificity or lack of specificity when you're trying to analyze at that scale, but you'll get the idea of what does that mean in terms of air quality emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, regional traffic throughout the Bay Area, growth, and how what might happen in one area would affect another area. And as you look through the alternatives in that, you'll also get some of the sense of what happens if development patterns throughout the entire Bay Area change. What if more development was concentrated in San Francisco? What if it was a more spread out pattern? And that will give you some of that large scale.
So the follow-up that I intended was, so in your experience or in your even judgment, but in your experience, have adjacent communities, and I don't know whether it just means the one north of us and the one south of us, but it could be more, have adjacent areas gotten together to review their EIRs jointly to see what they think the cumulative impact would be?
The simple answer is no. That doesn't usually happen. Remember also that what drives the preparation of an EIR is a public agency or a group of agencies being asked to take an action or approve a large-scale program. So the only time you'll see those large-scale EIRs is when an agency such as the MTC is being asked to approve a program over a very large area. But there are reviews that occurred as part of the preparation of Plan Bay Area to look at sub-regional growth in different areas, such as what would happen in the Bi-County areas from Hunters Point down through around the Cow Palace into the Baylands. And those reviews did occur in some smaller areas in the entirety of the Bay Area as part of that Plan Bay Area.
Okay.
Went fast.
I want to thank the city. I want to thank Lloyd Sola of ESA and his associate who's here, I don't know your name, for putting on this series for us. I think it's been very informative, and for me, it's really helped me look at the document. At this point, Lloyd Sola has agreed to come speak and answer questions on the 16th of July, which is a Tuesday evening, for the BBCAG, which is located at the community center underneath the library, the Brisbane Library. We really welcome all of you to come and bring your questions, and we can discuss it again in more depth. And I really do thank everyone for coming, and I think it's been very successful. Oh, excuse me, 7 to 9.
Carolyn, you might want to let the audience know what the scope of the BBCAGs, because they won't be reviewing the entire EIR, I don't believe. All the topics like traffic and...
Mary, did you want to come talk about that a bit?
Well, if a member of the community asked a question that was off topic for the BBCAG, I think we could probably go ahead and let him provide a quick answer. But the BBCAG's scope of work is contamination in the Baylands and how it affects human health and the environment. And so that's going to be what we're going to talk about.
Great, thank you. And we'll look forward, the Planning Commission will look forward to receiving more information in September. Uh-huh.
At the Planning Commission, will comments be limited to 3 minutes? And will 2 evenings be enough to take in all the comments?
Okay, so the question is, in September, there are scheduled 2 meetings. Will the meetings be limited, comments be limited to 3 minutes? And I don't think we have any direction at this time.
Well, the Planning Commission can set the rules for their own meeting, obviously, and how it operates. If 2 evenings isn't enough, I'm sure there's going to be the capacity to schedule meetings as needed to accept the community's input. So, but the commission will have to develop what those rules are for the meetings they hold.
Clara?
Will there be meetings at which Mr. Zola or one of his colleagues will speak at the PBNR, the public, I'm sorry?
Oh, come up and, this is getting complicated, come up and, hold on.
Parks and Recreation and Open Space, I'm sorry. I just wondered if there'll be an opportunity in August or July to hear Mr. Zola or one of his colleagues speak in front of the Open Space and Ecology or Parks and Recreation Commissions about issues that are related to their purview?
That can be arranged. Those dates haven't been set yet. That hasn't been determined. But if it does get established, that will be made available publicly, what those dates are. We don't have any dates scheduled at the moment.
What is the criteria on which it's going to be judged whether there is or is not arrangement made for that?
That'll be up to the purview of the various commissions to make that request.
Thank you.
Well, again, thank you very much for these series of 4 meetings. I think they've been very informative and very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn.